For a broader look at voting issues around the country, we're joined by Richard Hasen. He's a professor at the Loyola Law School in Los Angeles and an expert on election law. Professor Hasen, thanks for talking with us. What are the main voting-related problems around the country right now?
Well, there are different kinds of problems. Some of the problems relate to machines. And, since 2000, when we learned that the punch card machines were a big problem, we've switched over to other kinds of machines. And in some places, like in Palm Beach County, they're on their third set of machines in 3 major elections. And so some of it relates to rolling out new equipment. Some of it, as we just heard in that report, relate to questions over voter registration and matching databases. And some of them is just misinformation about who's entitled to vote and what the procedures are going to be on Election Day.
Are the problems mainly concentrated in the battleground states where we expect the vote to be the closest?
Well, I think that certainly the most attention nationally has been paid there, but there are problems in, all over the country. I think we know that there'll be some problems on Election Day scattered in different places throughout the country, but we're obviously going to focus on places like Ohio or Florida or Colorado where in a very close election, those electoral votes could matter for the outcome of the presidency.
Let's talk about the controversies surrounding ACORN, the group that was mentioned in that report, the Association of Community Organizations for Reform. Now, if you can take the partisanship out of that and help us understand what's the problem alleged to be.
Well, the way that this country works, unlike many other mature democracies, is that we don't have the government in the business of doing voter registration. We have private third parties going out and doing it. And so ACORN has been very successful. I think the figure's around 1.3 million registrations they've turned in. And it turns out that some of those registration forms are either fraudulent or contain incorrect information or duplicate information. And so there's a question as to what's going to happen with those forms, and there's a concern that some of those forms will lead to actual election fraud on Election Day. Turns out, though, that from all of our studies, there's almost no evidence that fraudulent registration leads to actual election fraud on Election Day, with people pretending they're Mickey Mouse or Joe Montana and showing up at the polls on Election Day.
So potentially you're saying how big disruption when it comes to counting votes?
Well, in terms of counting votes, I don't think that we're talking about a big disruption. The question is in terms of the bloated voter rolls and what it takes for election officials before Election Day to go through all those cards. And in a lot of states, by law, any card that a third-party group like ACORN collects, they have to turn in. So each of those cards have to be investigated, and that takes time. And so that's a problem. But it doesn't translate into any kind of concern about the integrity of the actual vote itself on Election Day.
Now, there was a U.S. Supreme Court ruling today that's getting some attention, having to do with Ohio and its voter registration list. Help us understand what that's about. Yeah,
well, you remember Ohio was very close last time between Kerry and Bush, and whoever won Ohio won the outcome. So it's a closely fought contest. There's been a lot of registration, and what the Ohio Republican Party was trying to do was to force the Secretary of State there, who's the chief elections officer, to turn over lists to counties of mismatches between the voter registration database and the motor vehicles database. And reports said that it could have been up to 200,000 mismatches, although lots of those are probably the result of data entry error or different uses of a name like Joe and Joseph or senior and junior and those kinds of problems. But those names now do not have to be produced by the Secretary and passed on to the Election Board.
So what's the upshot of that? What does that mean?
Well, so the question is what the Ohio Republican Party wanted those names for, and one possibility is they wanted those names to mount voter challenges on Election Day, to have a list of people to be on the lookout for at the polling places on Election Day. And we don't know if that would have happened or not, and there still could be challenges, but we don't have this list from the Secretary of State that could provide the basis for this anymore.
So essentially, we think, though, that's resolved, not expected to be any more legal action brought in Ohio on that issue, the voter registration list?
Yeah, well, on that particular issue, I think we're done, but there's been other litigation. There was an order this morning from the Ohio Supreme Court that the Secretary has to allow observers in to see what's going on in early voting. There's been litigation over missed boxes that needed to be checked on registration forms. There's still other stuff going on. And what's happened since 2000 is election administrations become more partisan. The parties are fighting more over these things. And so generally, there's just been a big uptick in litigation since 2000 over these kinds of problems.
Professor Hasen, we've also seen issues raised around college students. How much of an obstacle do college students face around the country? What's the problem potentially there?
Well, you know, you're allowed to vote where you are basically domiciled, where you expect that you're going to be living for the foreseeable future, and so college students do have the right to register and vote in their college towns. But sometimes that gets local resistance, and sometimes it's misinformation. So we saw reports last month of some of the Virginia county election officials giving wrong information, such as saying that if a college student voted in a college town, that the parents of the student wouldn't be able to claim that student as a dependent on income taxes. There's a lot of misinformation out there about when college students can vote and where they can vote.
Bottom line, we're going to hear more about that?
Well, you know, I don't know that that one's going to be a big one on Election Day. You know, the best thing in terms of election administration is if the election just isn't close, because if we look really closely at things, there are still problems. In fact, by some measures, I think we're in worse shape than we were in 2000.
So, again, I mean, you're saying we should brace ourselves for more, to hear much more about this between now and November 4th.
Yeah, I think so, and I think also because the parties are, you know, playing this up. You're hearing a lot from Republicans about voter fraud. You're hearing a lot from Democrats about voter suppression. You know, until we move to a system where we have nonpartisan election officials administering our federal elections on a national scale, it's hard to see how we get out of this cycle where we see this flurry of litigation in the months coming up to Election Day.
Rick Hasen from Loyola Law School in Los Angeles, thanks very much.
Thank you.